This video is sponsored by Squarespace. More about them in just a moment. The peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is robbing the human race. It seems the issue of free speech never quite leaves the public eye. In the 1980s, people were worried about religious organisations curbing free speech, and then the fears were around political correctness, and now they actually seem to be around both. But with a debate as popular and emotionally involved as this, it can be helpful to take a step back and ask, what are the arguments that justify the principle of free speech, and how might someone challenge them? This is just what we shall do today. We are going to take just one argument in favour of freedom of speech from J.S. Mill's unforgettable text on Liberty, and discuss the ways it has been criticised and defended over the past 150 years or so. By the end of the video, I hope you'll come away with a greater appreciation for some of the philosophy behind our most deeply held political touchstones. Get ready to learn why it might benefit us to be exposed to falsehoods, how certain you have to be to censor an opinion, and whether freedom of speech hinges on humans being unrealistically rational. I know I always say this, but I really cannot stress it enough. This is only scratching the surface of the literature and philosophy on the topic. It is just to whet your appetite for your own thinking, rather than serve as a comprehensive guide. So, with that out of the way, let's dive into this argument that has caused such historic controversy. But before any of that, I want to take a moment to thank our very kind sponsor, Squarespace. If you're looking to build a website, then you know it can be an absolute nightmare. First, you have to find a domain name, then you have to construct the thing, and there's always the underlying fear that you're messing it up and creating something that looks both untidy and unprofessional. But this is where Squarespace comes into play. They compress all of that busy work into a single platform and use templates to take most of the complication and pain out of website building. They also have a feature called Design Intelligence, which uses AI tools to help you make design choices, which is really handy if, like me, you're not necessarily that technologically gifted and don't have the mind of a graphic designer. Head to squarespace.com/unsolicited advice and use the code unsolicited advice to get 10% off your first purchase of a domain name or a website. But anyway, back to the video. 1. Libertre, Egalite, and Uncertainte. If you were an intellectual in the UK in the mid-19th century, it was impossible not to engage with the work of John Stuart Mill. He was popping up everywhere, making innovations in logic, ethics, politics, and more. His particular emphasis on freedom, individual rights, and tolerance has probably influenced the Western world at least as much as any other thinker. He has a whole chapter in On Liberty dedicated to arguments in favour of free expression. And the one we'll focus on today concerns how he thinks freedom of speech benefits us all, even when it is speech we vehemently disagree with. The first thing to note is that Mill is starting from a presumption that someone has the right to do whatever they want with their body and mind, provided that it is not hurting anyone else. This is the starting point for his entire political philosophy in this period. According to him, an individual has ultimate sovereignty over their speech, their actions, and their thoughts, so long as it does not hurt anyone else in the process. I want to mention this because it is by no means a given in a political worldview. In some strains of Christian thought, it is simply false to say that you have normative sovereignty over your actions. You may be able to choose what you do, but you ought to align those choices with God's will. He is the person that has ultimate sovereignty over your soul. Likewise, someone might think that our minds and bodies are not rightly our own, but instead we should use them as instruments to serve a wider community. Mill's starting point can sound obvious if we already agree with it, but it is open to challenge, and that is worth acknowledging. The rest of Mill's point essentially argues that the principle of free speech is beneficial because it allows for a greater proliferation of ideas. And this in turn is vital if a society is going to maximize the number of publicly held true beliefs. Broadly speaking, there are two components to Mill's argument. The first is to do with epistemic uncertainty, and the second a general optimism about argumentation. Essentially, Mill's first point is that we should never be so sure of a belief that some later information could not come along and change our minds. Even in paradigm cases of certainty, like mathematical proof, it could be that we have misunderstood the proof, or that there is a mistake in it that we'd never previously spotted. Essentially, whenever we form an opinion, it goes through a fallible process, namely, us. This is not some exhortation to idle skepticism. Mill definitely thinks we can be sure enough of our beliefs to act on them. He just doesn't think we can be so sure as to declare that no possible challenge to that belief would ever be relevant or deserve consideration. He toys with the possible exception of beliefs of extreme utility, but we'll discuss that a bit more later. At the very least, if we do not accept that we should always keep our own beliefs open to challenge, we might be more amenable to the idea that we should not be so sure of ourselves as to prevent others from being exposed to opposing viewpoints. We might be confident enough to isolate ourselves from opposition if we so please, but it goes a step further to say that no one should be exposed to this opposition. Thus, in Mill's view, guarding freedom of speech allows us to be exposed to ideas which challenge our worldview and thus facilitate our learning. He never thinks it is epistemically justified to put a belief permanently to rest. Secondly, Mill tends to think that the only way to fully extinguish bad ideas is to have them defeated over and over again in open dialogue. In his view, if you push an opinion underground, you implicitly give the message that you are scared that it would withstand scrutiny if it ever got out. Thus, he suggests that while these opinions will certainly never gain prominence if we actively repress them efficiently enough, they will also never be fully eliminated. Instead, he thinks they'll persist in isolated, underground groups. According to him, this is because while they are prevented from spreading, they are also prevented from facing much direct challenge. If you prevent an idea from being heard in full, it also cannot be defeated in full. And since humans tend to come up with the same ideas over and over again, suppression only delays a concept's arrival rather than fully defeating it. Of course, underlying this is the assumption that false beliefs will tend to be defeated by true beliefs if they ever engage in open dialogue. This is a proposition that is very much open to challenge. Thirdly, Mill is even worried about true beliefs if they are not vigorously questioned, at least from time to time. This is because he thinks they will eventually become dead dogma, not living truth. This is not so much a distinction in the content of the belief, but rather why it is held. This ties back to the idea by Plato that a justification grounds a belief, and so both makes it more difficult to dislodge and also makes it more apt to influence our behavior. Mill's worry is that if we do not expose true beliefs to challenges, then people will remember a proposition and probably remember it's true, but they won't know why that is the case. Ironically, he might say that this has happened to us regarding our views on freedom of speech. Most people see themselves as pretty pro-free speech, even those that have been accused of being its opponents. But our ignorance of the philosophical foundations of this standpoint make it much easier to dislodge, or for us to forget it. At least that would be Mill's position on the subject. For him, knowing the reasons behind a belief are almost as important as holding what he sees as the correct beliefs. Immediately, there are two things I want to note about these points. The first is that they are not rights-based arguments, but instead consequence-based ones. Mill is a firm utilitarian, and even though he revised aspects of this later in his life, he is still clear that the greatest good for the greatest number is still the test for any of his recommendations. Thus, his arguments are, to a great extent, empirical hypotheses. He suggests they provide strong reasons for thinking that a general principle of free speech should be held. This also leaves it open for someone else to argue that although his principle holds in general, there are exceptions where a belief's challenge does not promote the greatest good for the greatest number. Although Mill would think they would incur a heavy argumentative burden in showing that. As we'll see later in the video, this is very much the line of argument that many people calling for a certain amount of restrictions on certain types of speech have made. The second observation is that none of Mill's arguments are limited to specifically governmental power. There are other philosophers who largely constrain their points in favour of free speech to governmental power. Locke does for the most part, if my memory serves. But Mill explicitly clarifies that his scope is wider than this. For instance, he says that most active suppression on speech is not done by governments, but by cultural taboos. And he argues that these should be actively combated to allow for more speech to be had that is public and unimpeded. I mention this because a lot of popular discussions about freedom of speech rest quite heavily on this distinction between governmental power and non-governmental power. But if you're arguing on utilitarian grounds, this does not inherently matter. Right, I know that was a lot to take in, but with that out of the way, let's crack on with some criticisms. Starting with some of the challenges that have been levelled at Mill's core assumptions. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider becoming one of my wonderful patrons. You'll be supporting the channel and gain access to exclusive content. The link is in the description. 2. Naivety and Humanity. One of the most influential recent papers criticising Mill's style of argumentation for free speech comes from the philosopher Brian Later. He himself is no opponent of freedom of speech, but he is sceptical about the kinds of reasons Mill gives for supporting it. Later points out that the argument we just discussed is primarily an epistemic one. People have argued for freedom of speech on the basis of individual unalienable rights, because personal expression is key to fulfillment, and because it is the best position of a bad bunch when it comes to regulating speech. However, Mill's argument here is to do with acquiring and spreading knowledge. But later points out that when we really care about people making accurate judgments, we purposefully curate the information they get access to. Since he's a philosopher of law, he primarily leans on the example of the courtroom. Later points out that a courtroom is probably the arena of life where we care the most about truth. All through proceedings, there are oaths to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and juries are purposefully instructed to only convict people if the evidence demonstrates they committed the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. And yet, precisely because we care about the truth so much in this context, we are very careful about the information a jury has access to, and the propositions they use when forming their judgments. For instance, there are rules stating what cannot be admitted into evidence. Then there are exceptions to those rules in special cases. There are guidelines for when an expert's testimony is valid and when it should be discarded. Even some information that would be informative is disregarded if it would also be seen to prejudice the jury too much. So the prior convictions of the defendant are not mentioned, even though if someone commits a crime once, they are more likely to commit another crime than a random member of the public. Later suggests there is actually quite a lot of skepticism about the ability of a lay jury to find a correct verdict without this prior curation of what they can and cannot see. A judge can even instruct them to disregard a piece of evidence that they have seen. This all mirrors worries Mill had about what restrictions on speech would do. They would limit the information people had access to. And yet here, we tend to think it leads to more accurate convictions rather than fewer ones. So, on the face of it, we have a contradiction. If more freely expressed information, on average, leads to more accurate opinions, why do we not have far fewer restrictions on what can be said in courtroom settings? For later, and indeed for many others, the courtroom view makes sense because humans are not primarily rational in our decision-making. We have endless heuristics, prejudices, and biases, all of which can lead us to mistake a false but convincing opinion for a true one. The same point was made thousands of years ago by Aristotle, when he said that facts alone are often not enough to convince almost anyone of almost anything. We must have some use of rhetoric so that our emotions can be influenced in line with our reason. To list a few human biases from as widespread sources as Schopenhauer and Kahneman, we are more likely to confirm a pre-existing opinion than to challenge it, we are more likely to believe things when they are repeated to us, we view good-looking speakers as more trustworthy, and we have an in-group bias to favor people who we believe are like us or part of our tribe. All of this would interfere with our ability to discern between competing opinions if we're not very careful. And how many of us have the time to evaluate every single source for bias? There are only so many hours in the day. Later suggests it is more likely we would end up believing a whole load of falsehoods than that the unfettered spurting forth of millions of viewpoints would somehow converge on a set of truths. Otherwise, everyone on Twitter would eventually believe the same set of propositions. The truth would win out in the end. People are debating there all the time. It is effectively the modern version of standing on Speaker's Corner. And yet, it would be a stretch to say it has been a fantastic thing for the proliferation of true beliefs. At the very least, you'd be hard-pressed to argue that truth has won out an overwhelming majority of the time. If that were true, we would expect to see some form of strong convergent agreement effect, and I don't think we've quite seen that. Later points out that Mill's own arguments are caveated with the idea that freedom of speech should only occur with mature, intellectually developed agents. Mill may have thought that anyone could eventually fit this criteria, but later disagrees. If by mature and intellectually developed, we mean likely to critically and objectively evaluate propositions and come to true beliefs, then it may be that very few of us would make the cut. It could also be that we would make the cut in some fields, but not in others. I am much better equipped to evaluate claims about 20th century analytic philosophy than I am about how to make a great lasagna. In effect, later argues the question of speech in society is more helpfully framed as how can we best limit speech that is epistemically useless and promote that which is epistemically useful. Although, later is not blind to the problems with this view either. He essentially bumps up against Mill's first point about epistemic uncertainty, but in a different guise. The question arises, Who can be trusted to make decisions about what speech to restrict, not just in one context, but all through a society? A big disanalogy between the court system and wider society is one of scope and scale. Whereas you can step outside a courtroom and complain about court proceedings or even try to have them changed, the same is not true for widely applied bans on speech. If I am barred from giving evidence in a courtroom, I could still write to the papers about it. But if I am banned from publishing it at all, then it has no arena in which to air. In his later writings on the issue, Libertre concludes roughly the same thing about freedom of speech as Churchill semi-apocryphally did about democracy. Namely, that having as few as possible restrictions on speech is the worst policy. You know, apart from all of the others that we've tried. If you agree with Libertre's pro-free speech conclusion here, this is still importantly different from Mill's original position. Mill had a far more positive conception of the marketplace of ideas. He argued this would have a serious beneficial effect on the proliferation of true beliefs. But Libertre's conclusion is very different. It suggests that while in an ideal world there would be far better systems for regulating speech, since we are flawed humans, there is no practical way to find out or implement this supposed ideal system. And thus, freedom of speech is not great, it's just the best policy we can come up with. To a certain extent, this follows from Libertre's criticisms about the epistemic responsibility of human agents. If we cannot be trusted to weigh up all the different ideas on offer and pick the most accurate ones, then surely we can't be trusted to judge which ideas other people should have access to. At the very least, we need to have some pretty strong reasons for picking a particular person or set of people to make these decisions on which speech to restrict. However, let's move away from criticisms of the principle of free speech per se, and move on to looking at those who have argued for exceptions to it. And arguably, the most logically interesting of these comes from one of the great influential thinkers of the 20th century and survivor of a Wittgensteinian poker attack, Karl Popper. 3. Self-Undermining and Excessive Freedom. Before I begin this section, let me warn you that it contains a couple of tangents about the history of logic that are not strictly relevant to the topic at hand, but are very interesting, so I hope you'll bear with me. At the beginning of the 20th century, there emerged a number of paradoxes that I will call paradoxes of size or paradoxes of self-reference. The most famous of these is probably Russell's paradox, which implied that there cannot be a set for every definable property, since the set of things which are not members of themselves is definable but would be contradictory. This refuted Frege's Basic Law 5, which he tried to use to ground mathematics in logic. Gödel's incompleteness theorem is arguably another paradox of size, since it uses the expressiveness of a mathematical system to construct a sentence which can neither be proven nor disproven within that system. We can skim over the details here, but the general lesson is this. When a system becomes large or complex enough that self-referential sentences can be constructed, we are likely to run into logical or practical difficulties. This is potentially the intuition behind Karl Popper's famous paradox of tolerance. This is probably best set up with a thought experiment. Let's imagine that we lived in a society where any opinion can be expressed without repercussions. One of these opinions might be, there should be no freedom of speech. This might also be accompanied by views that freedom of action or of opinion should also be seriously curtailed. At first, we try to fight this opinion with ideas, and yet it seems to be gaining traction. Eventually, it gains enough support that people try to enforce this new authoritarianism either by using public shame or by physical force. At this point, what do? Do we ourselves use shame or other extra-rational means to combat this speech, perhaps even government suppression? Or do we stick by our principles and as a result put freedom of speech itself at risk? Popper suggests that in the exceptional circumstance where the notion of pluralistic tolerance itself were under threat, we should be prepared to use force to suppress certain viewpoints, provided that these are the ones that would bring about the end of the overarching principles of free and tolerant speech that we are trying to protect. In effect, it's closing a loophole. It says diversity of expressed opinion should be tolerated, except for those which threaten the overall principle that diversity of expressed opinion should be tolerated. It's the same logic that has led certain democracies to banning anti-democratic political organizations. The idea there is that you can vote for anything apart from the end of voting itself. This is a really interesting argument, in that it exposes a potential practical weakness of such a broad scope principle as the freedom to express any opinion. An opinion can go back and undermine the very principle that allowed it to exist unimpeded. Over a century before this, John Locke had argued that freedom of expression should not be extended to atheists, since he believed they recognized no moral authority, and so would use this freedom to undermine the very government which safeguarded that freedom. Obviously, I disagree with Locke's initial premise, but you can see the similarities in the structure of the argument here. In some ways, by arguing that neither government nor social shame should suppress opinions, Mill is halfway on board with Popper's argument. After all, if he's intending to use the government and other levers of power to grant free speech and then protect it, he is neutering the effectiveness of anyone who argues that there should not be freedom of expression. Even if they would be allowed to say it, it clearly would not be as efficacious as expressing other opinions. Likewise, if Mill argues that freedom of speech should be permitted because it leads to positive consequences, then he may be open to defending it with force on the grounds that inaction in such a situation would lead to negative consequences, namely the abolition of free speech. Again, if we are using consequentialist arguments for and against freedom of speech, then people can argue for special exceptions to the rule on consequentialist grounds. Popper's exception is where the principle of free and tolerant speech is credibly threatened by an opposing viewpoint. This is where his liberal pluralism ends, and he is willing to defend something with force at a first-order level. For other thinkers, their pluralism is a bit less tolerant, such as those who argue that certain forms of speech are inherently harmful, like verbal harassment. They are signaling that they are confident that allowing such speech would be of greater negative consequences than appointing a set of people to distinguish between harassment and non-harassment and then enforce a ban on harassment. On a wider scale, much of the contemporary debate about freedom of speech rests on certain examples which people consider credible exceptions to the general rule. Some of these exceptions have become pretty uncontroversial. For all the people who will call themselves free speech absolutists, there aren't many full absolutists about. Not many people would argue that we should be allowed to shout "bomb" at an airport or "give me your wallet or I'll attack you" to someone in a dark alley at 2 a.m. Or to claim that one is a qualified surgeon here to perform a triple bypass if that is not true. Most people allow exceptions for things like fraud and open threats. However, there are areas of speech and expression that remain hotly disputed. The most common of these is speech that is deemed as hateful, while another is explicit nude content. There are two things that anyone arguing for a restriction on a certain type of speech tend to want to demonstrate. The first is that this type of speech is plausibly demarcatable from other types of speech. Famously, Justice Potter Stewart of the US Supreme Court said that obscene material could have no fixed definition, but just said, "You know it when you see it." In a post-Wittgensteinian world where we recognize that many terms are not defined by a Platonic-style set of necessary and sufficient conditions, but rather a collection of family resemblances between items falling under that label, demarcating certain types of speech from others becomes very difficult. Nonetheless, difficult is not the same thing as impossible. There is no clear definition of joke, but there are clear examples of jokes and clear examples of things that are not jokes. My beautiful copy of Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica is not a joke, no matter what Gödel tells you. That, on the other hand, was a joke, even if it's not a very funny one. Then, if we are arguing on consequentialist grounds, the second thing someone might want to demonstrate is that putting restrictions in place for this type of speech would lead to greater good than not doing so. Again, in the case of protected terms like doctor or surgeon, we ban people from saying they are these things when they are not, because of the chaos that would emerge if anyone could say the word surgeon, put on a lab coat, and end up at the operating table. Likewise, for things like shouting fire in a crowded place in full knowledge that there is not one. The consequences for allowing this to happen are potentially catastrophic, and enforcing the law here is a relatively small incursion on people's general liberties. Those who argue for obscene nude content or hateful speech to be banned tend to suggest that the consequences of permitting it are likely to be more negative than enforcing a ban would. Those who oppose these arguments tend to suggest the opposite. They often suggest that without a rigorous definition of what exactly falls into the prohibited categories, any ban could have a chilling effect on public discourse. Like we said in the last section, we may also question who could possibly be qualified to make the call on what speech should be banned and what speech should be permitted. And remember, if the argument is taking place on consequentialist grounds, there is no reason the scope would be limited to governmental action. For instance, in the UK, there are certain laws in place which protect people from consequences for expressing certain religious or philosophical views at work. You cannot be fired for expressing these views apart from in exceptional circumstances. This is a judgment about the limitations of punishment for someone's beliefs even in the private sector. It is a common refrain that freedom of speech is not freedom from consequences, but the nature of permissible consequences is often precisely what these debates are about. Otherwise, we would see no problem with the rather cheeky statement made by Ugandan military dictator Idi Amin that there is freedom of speech, but I cannot guarantee freedom after speech. That was an awful lot to take in, and obviously I've skimmed over a huge amount of detail. I just wanted to give you a flavour of the reasoning patterns people tend to use to argue for certain speech to be restricted, and the ways people have countered that. If you're interested, I've linked a couple of SEP articles in the description. This is always a good starting point if you want to read more about anything in philosophy. But lastly, I want to clarify some general positions which are often conflated in the free speech debate, and provide a different way of thinking about the issue. If we cannot fix the discourse here, perhaps we can at least get a clear view of the territory. 4. Freedoms of speech and possible positions. In public discourse, the term freedom of speech is often thrown around without an awful lot of clarification. In fact, up to this point, I've been doing the very same thing in this video. But there are a huge number of positions that being pro-free speech or anti-free speech potentially covers. So, let's talk about some different philosophical standpoints on freedom of speech so you can see where you sit. First, there are those who argue for freedom of speech on the basis that this is a right someone has. This is a very different way of arguing than the one we've just been looking at. Here, it is not necessarily suggested that freedom of speech has positive consequences, but rather that it's something that someone has a right to. Often, people arguing from this standpoint say that this right ends when it infringes on the rights of others. Immanuel Kant might be a good example of this position. He thought people had a right to express whatever opinions they wanted, but only within the bounds of respecting others as rational agents in his famous Kingdom of Ends. On the other hand, there are those who deny that there is any peculiar right someone has to freedom of speech. Surprisingly, Mill is arguably one of these. While he argues that people have sovereignty over their body and mind, he only thinks this because, as a general rule, he reckons it will have positive utilitarian consequences. On the other hand, there are those whose position on free speech is motivated by these consequences. Mill is a classic example of this. As we have seen, he thinks that the free expression of whatever opinion someone happens to hold is justified because of the benefits it will bring to that society. He thinks it will accelerate learning, prevent dogmatic thinking, and allow for the transmission of true beliefs. Many people who argue for certain restrictions on speech also do so on consequentialist grounds, as we've just seen. But this is an important distinction, because if you think that free expression is grounded in some right that someone has, then you might think that utilitarian consequences are largely irrelevant to whether it is appropriate to curtail that right. It would only be when it interferes with some other right that they would say we should start to place restrictions. So, that covers the bases for arguments in favour or against free speech. Next, we can distinguish between those who think freedom of speech is an outright good policy and those who think it is just the best of a bad bunch. For instance, Mill thinks that freedom of speech will have good consequences full stop, and that even if there was an ideal way of regulating speech, we should still not put it in place. Whereas later eventually concludes that it is simply a bit better than trusting anyone in particular to regulate speech outside of very defined examples. This is quite a different claim. It suggests that if in the future there was some way of regulating speech in an unbiased manner, then we should do that instead of having the principle of free speech. Whereas Mill gives the strong indication that he thinks free expression is going to have better consequences than no free expression, however sophisticated our potential means for regulating speech becomes. We might call this viewing freedom of speech as an ideal, as opposed to later who we might call a pragmatic supporter of free speech. Now, we can think about positions on how free speech should be as sitting along a spectrum. There is basically no one at the extremes of this spectrum, as very few people think there should be no freedom of expression, and very few think we should be allowed to say anything at any time. However, there are a lot of intermediate positions between these two extremes. Despite how often it's invoked, Popper's proposed restrictions on speech are very limited. They're only to be used when the principle of pluralistic tolerance itself is under threat. To move further along the scale, in the UK we have much stricter defamation laws than somewhere like the United States. Then, there are those who posit further restrictions on speech, such as obscenity laws or constraints on hateful speech. There are also thinkers that are more paternalistic, arguing that even more categories of speech should be constrained. Oftentimes, these restrictions are argued for on consequentialist grounds, though it is possible to use a rights-based framework here as well. And likewise, you could oppose these restrictions either on the basis of consequences or on the basis of rights, or a mixture of both. Lastly, we can think about the scope of our claims about free speech. For example, you might want to argue that governments have an obligation to restrict speech as minimally as possible, but that this is as far as protection should spread. This would mean that private companies, groups of people, and individuals would have no particular obligation to respect someone's right to free speech, and thus would be free to impose certain consequences for the expression of certain views, like firing or ostracization. As we've said, Mill goes much further than this and suggests that we should neither restrict speech through governmental edict or by social stigma. You might also think that different types of speech deserve different levels of protection. A relatively common position you'll find online is that statements deemed hateful speech should not warrant prosecution, but also should not be immune from social censure, while other types of speech should neither be prosecuted nor censured. As I've already said, in UK law, employers have some obligation to respect the speech of their employees, but this does not extend to all speech that is not illegal. You are entitled to express religious and philosophical views at work without being fired, but you are not allowed to call your boss a wanker, no matter how much argumentation you have to back it up. Considering the wide range of possible positions along this spectra, it is a shame that it's often collapsed into debating who is for or against free speech. Perhaps a slightly more productive way of framing the discussion is to say which restrictions, if any, would we like to place on speech, on what basis, with which scope, and in which situations. Sure, that is a bit of a mouthful, but it allows for a far more nuanced conversation. Given Mill's hope that unrestricted speech would be used to explore ideas in an honest and good faith manner, I can only think that this would be in the spirit of his approach. But if you want to look at how bad things can truly get when freedom of expression is completely curtailed, then click here to learn the philosophy behind Orwell's spectacular novel 1984. I hope you enjoyed this video and have a wonderful day.